Greetings, dear listeners. My name is Walter Harrison. I've found in my 72 years that true power is rarely loud. It is often found in the quiet rustle of old paper. Today, I am going to tell you a story about a small man who made a very loud noise and the quiet paragraph on page 84 that silenced him completely. Before we begin this entry from my ledger, I want to thank you for being here. This is a place for stories where patience and preparation prevail over arrogance. If that sounds like a fair trade to you, please take a moment to subscribe and press the like button, and do leave a comment with your city or country. It is a genuine pleasure to know where these stories find a home. Now to the matter at hand. It began, as things often do, in a garden. Since my wife, Eleanor, passed 4 years ago, her rose garden has been my sanctuary. It is not merely a plot of land behind my house. It is the last living piece of a 40-year conversation. She chose every bush, every color. She knew their names like old friends. The deep reds she called Mr. Lincoln, the pale yellows, Peace. My job was simply to keep the conversation going. But our quiet neighborhood had a new king, a recently retired gentleman named Gerald Abernathy, who, having left a career as a mid-level manager, had been elected president of our homeowners association. Mr. Abernathy carried his newfound authority not with grace, but with a clipboard and a measuring tape, which he seemed to consult with the gravity of a brain surgeon. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday, a crisp white envelope bearing the official, slightly pompous HOA letterhead. I opened it with mild curiosity. The violation, it stated in bold letters, was a serious one. A single errant branch of a peace rose had extended 1.5 inches over the public sidewalk, a transgression of the highest order. I read the notice twice, not with anger, but with a certain professional amusement. The man was meticulous in his pettiness. It was, in its own way, impressive. So that afternoon I took out my finest pair of pruning shears, measured the distance precisely, and made the cut. I even swept the single fallen leaf from the pavement. I had complied. But, as I learned long ago from the bench, to a certain kind of man, compliance is not seen as a gesture of peace. It is seen as a confession of weakness. And so the letters continued. A notice about the unapproved terracotta color of a small flower pot, a warning about the non-uniform height of the boxwood hedges, a formal complaint about the brand of organic fertilizer I was using. With each new letter, I did what I had done for 40 years in the face of escalating arguments. I did not get emotional. I did not complain. I documented. Each violation notice was placed in a new clean file folder. I took a photograph of the offense and a photograph after I had corrected it. I made notes on the dates and times. I was, without yet knowing it, building my case. Mr. Abernathy, meanwhile, grew bolder. He would stand on the sidewalk just beyond my property line with his clipboard held to his chest. He would stare at the roses, his lips pursed in disapproval. He was a man who had been given a hammer, and to him my entire life, my wife's entire legacy, now looked like a nail that needed to be struck. This quiet siege continued for the entire summer. It was a war of 1,000 paper cuts. I knew it was leading somewhere. A man like Abernathy does not stop. He escalates, always seeking the final crushing victory. I did not have to wait long. The letter that finally broke the peace arrived with the first chill of autumn, and it was no longer about a single rose branch. The envelope was thicker this time, heavier. It had the self-important feel of a legal document. I opened it with my silver letter opener, the one Eleanor gave me on my first day as a judge. Inside was a multi-page notice filled with dense paragraphs and citations from the HOA bylaws. The document outlined a series of escalating fines for my previous uncorrected violations I had, of course, corrected and documented. The total was an absurd figure, $10,000. But that was not the true purpose of the letter. The fine was merely the predicate, the legal justification for the final demand. The final paragraph stated that due to my persistent and willful disregard for community standards, the HOA Architectural Review Committee, chaired by Mr. Abernathy himself, had declared the entire rose garden a non-compliant landscape feature. I was given 30 days to remove it completely, every last bush, or the HOA would place a lien on my house. He was trying to take my house over roses. It was a declaration of total war. But even that was not the part that sealed his fate. Stapled to the back of the official notice was a small personal note written on Mr. Abernathy's own stationery in a smug, looping script. The note read, "Judge Harrison, perhaps it is time to let go of the past and plant something more uniform. This is a neighborhood, not a memorial park." He had taken his clipboard and his ruler, and he had drawn a line directly across the memory of my wife. I did not get angry. The feeling that washed over me was colder, heavier. It was the feeling I used to get in the courtroom when a truly malicious person revealed their character on the stand. A feeling of profound disappointment in human nature, followed by a quiet, steely resolve. He had not just insulted me, he had insulted Eleanor, and that was a trespass for which there could be no simple pardon. I walked from the kitchen to my study, the letter in my hand. I passed the living room, where a portrait of Eleanor hung over the fireplace. In it she was smiling, standing in the middle of her garden in full bloom. I looked at her smiling face, then down at the ugly words in my hand. The time for pruning shears and quiet compliance was over. In my study, I have a set of bookshelves dedicated entirely to the law. But on the lowest shelf, separate from the others, sits a single, thick, leather-bound volume. It is the original founding charter and the complete, unamended book of bylaws for our homeowners association, printed in 1974. I am quite certain no one, least of all Mr. Abernathy, had ever read it cover to cover. I pulled the heavy book from the shelf. It smelled of old paper and forgotten ink. I placed it on my desk. I sat down, took out a yellow legal pad and my reading glasses. Mr. Abernathy had chosen to fight me using the rules, a foolish choice. He was bringing a knife to a cannon fight. He just didn't know it yet. I opened the book to the first page. Article 1, Name and Purpose. I began to read. I was not looking for a defense. I was not looking for a way to save the roses. That was no longer the objective. I was looking for a weapon, and I knew with the certainty of 40 years on the bench that somewhere in the dense, boring, and forgotten pages of his own rule book, Mr. Abernathy had left one for me to find. My study became my war room. The heavy, leather-bound book of bylaws became my primary intelligence. For 3 days, I did nothing but read. I started at page 1 and went line by line. I had my legal pads next to me, one for each article of the charter. I made notes. I used different colored highlighters, yellow for procedural rules, pink for financial obligations, and blue for penalties. It was, as I suspected, a terribly written document, a Frankenstein's monster of legalese cobbled together over decades by various committees of well-meaning but amateur lawyers. It was filled with contradictions, vague language, and forgotten clauses from a bygone era. To a man like Abernathy, it was a weapon to be swung like a club. To me, it was a poorly secured armory, and I was simply looking for the key. During this time, Mr. Abernathy became even more emboldened by my silence. He would make a point of walking past my house every morning, clipboard in hand. He would stop on the sidewalk, shake his head in theatrical disapproval at the rose garden, and make a note. He thought he was intimidating me. He had no idea he was merely providing further evidence for my file. On the 5th day of my research, I took a break. I went for a walk. But it was not a casual stroll. It was a reconnaissance mission. I walked every street in our neighborhood, looking at each house not as a home, but as a potential piece of evidence. I was no longer just Walter Harrison, the retiree. I was Judge Harrison, surveying his jurisdiction. My walk took me past Mr. Abernathy's own house. It was a newer model, larger than mine, with a perfectly manicured lawn that looked like a green carpet. And in his backyard, visible from the street, was a new, very large, and very expensive-looking wooden deck. It was well built, but something about it felt wrong, too new, too prominent. That evening, I returned to the bylaws, but I was no longer searching randomly. I had a target. I went straight to Article 7, Architectural Modifications and Improvements. The section was long and tedious. It detailed the complex multi-step approval process required for any significant structural addition, including decks, patios, and gazebos. It required architectural drawings, neighbor impact statements, and a full vote from the review committee. I then went to my other bookshelf, the one containing my personal records. I pulled out the file I had kept for the past year, the official monthly minutes from every HOA meeting. I cross-referenced the dates. The deck was built in May. I read the minutes for March, April, and May. There was no mention of a deck, no architectural review, no vote. And then I found it. I almost missed it. It was a single sentence buried deep in a subsection from an amendment made in 1978, a poorly worded, almost forgotten relic. It stated that any unapproved structural modification that was not self-reported within 90 days would be subject to a summary and non-negotiable penalty. The penalty was not a fine. A fine can be argued, negotiated, or paid. This was something far more beautiful and far more brutal. The penalty was a mandatory restoration of the property to its original state at the homeowner's expense, and if the restoration was not completed within 60 days, the HOA was contractually obligated to file a lien and force the sale of the property to cover the costs. Mr. Abernathy, in his arrogant crusade against my wife's roses, had forgotten his own history. He had broken his own most sacred rule. He had built a beautiful new deck, and in doing so, he had handed me the legal hammer that was about to bring down his entire house. The annual community meeting was in 2 weeks. It would be the perfect venue for my verdict. With my discovery complete, the nature of my work changed. I was no longer a researcher. I was a trial lawyer preparing for his closing argument. It spent the next several days assembling my evidence into a single, undeniable presentation. It was a process I had repeated thousands of times in my career. It felt like coming home.
First, the photographic evidence. I took a high-resolution photograph of Mr. Abernathy's deck from the public sidewalk. I then went to the county records office and retrieved a copy of the original plot plan for his property, showing the backyard as it was before the deck was built. A clear before and after. Next, the documentation. I made photocopies of the relevant pages from the HOA meeting minutes from March, April, and May, highlighting the complete absence of any submission or vote regarding the deck. I then photocopied Article 7 in its entirety and used a red pen to draw a single neat box around the obscure, powerful penalty clause from 1978. I even prepared a visual aid, a simple, large diagram showing the timeline. Deck constructed, May. 90-day reporting window closes, August. Current date, October. It was the kind of simple, devastating proof that leaves no room for argument. Juries and neighbors love a clear timeline. As the day of the annual meeting approached, Mr. Abernathy's arrogance grew in proportion to my silence. He saw my lack of response to his $10,000 fine not as a sign of preparation, but as a sign of surrender. He believed the old judge had been broken. He started telling neighbors that he expected my house would be on the market by spring. The day before the meeting, he made one final fatal move. Another white envelope appeared in my mailbox. Inside was not a fine, but a formal agenda for the annual meeting. He had listed as the primary point of new business, discussion and final action regarding the non-compliant Harrison property. He had made my humiliation a public spectacle. He had, in effect, scheduled his own execution. He had built the stage, sent out the invitations, and was now preparing to hand me the microphone. I took his agenda and placed it at the very front of my evidence file. It would serve as the perfect introduction to my presentation. That evening, I did not pace my study nervously. I did not review my notes. My case was prepared. It was flawless. Instead, I went out to the garden. I spent an hour in the crisp autumn air, deadheading the last of Eleanor's Mr. Lincoln roses, their deep red petals like velvet in the fading light. It was a quiet, peaceful moment, the calm before a very specific and very targeted storm. I went to bed early and slept soundly. I have always found that there is no better sleep aid than the quiet confidence that comes from being completely and utterly prepared. Mr. Abernathy, I imagined, was likely awake, practicing the triumphant speech he intended to give. The annual meeting was held in the drab, linoleum-floored community center clubhouse. The air smelled of stale coffee and self-importance. About 30 neighbors were there. Mr. Abernathy sat at the head of a long, folding table, flanked by his nervous committee members.
He looked out at us all, puffed up his chest, and banged a small wooden gavel. The show was about to begin. The meeting began with the usual tedious formalities, a reading of last year's minutes, a treasurer's report that balanced to the penny, delivered with breathless importance. I sat quietly in the third row, my file resting on my lap. I did not look at Mr. Abernathy. I did not need to. I could feel his smug, triumphant gaze on me from across the room. He let the treasurer finish, then cleared his throat, a loud, theatrical sound designed to command attention. "And now," he announced, his voice booming slightly in the small room, "we move to the primary item of new business, the matter of the Harrison property at 12 Oak Lane." A few of my neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their plastic chairs. "As you all know," Abernathy began, "this board has worked tirelessly to uphold the aesthetic standards that make Oakhaven such a desirable community." He spoke as if he were addressing a shareholder meeting, not a group of people who just wanted to know when the community pool was closing for the season. "Unfortunately," he continued, shaking his head with practiced sorrow, "we have encountered a persistent issue with one property. Despite numerous warnings and generous opportunities to comply, the resident has refused to address a series of significant violations, primarily concerning an overgrown and non-conforming landscape feature." He said landscape feature with the same disdain one might use for toxic waste dump. He was talking about Eleanor's roses. He was reducing her life's passion to a line item on an agenda, a problem to be managed. I kept my expression neutral. I focused on a small water stain on the ceiling tile above his head. In a courtroom, you learn to master your face. "Therefore," Abernathy declared, his voice rising to a crescendo, "it is with a heavy heart that this board has levied a substantial fine and has issued a final order for the complete removal of the offending feature. If the resident does not comply within the allotted time frame, the board will be forced to pursue all available legal remedies, including the placement of a lien on the property." He finished his speech and looked directly at me, a challenging, victorious glint in his eye. He expected me to argue, to plead, to make an emotional scene that he could gavel into submission. The room was silent. Everyone turned to look at me, the condemned man. I let the silence hang for a moment. Then, slowly, I raised my hand, not in a frantic wave, but a calm, simple gesture. "Mr. President," I said, my voice quiet but carrying easily in the still room, "if I may have a moment to address the board on this matter." Abernathy smirked. This was exactly what he wanted. The old judge was going to beg for his roses. "The chair recognizes Judge Harrison," he said, the title dripping with condescension. I stood up. I did not walk to the front of the room. I remained by my chair. I opened the file on my lap. "Thank you," I said, looking not at Abernathy, but making eye contact with each of the other board members, one by one. "I am not here this evening to discuss the matter of the fine or the roses." I paused, letting the confusion settle in the room. "I am here to discuss a different and far more serious violation of the bylaws, one that poses a significant and immediate legal liability to this entire association. It concerns the property at 24 Chestnut Drive." Abernathy's address. A confused murmur went through the room.
Mr. Abernathy, who had been leaning back in his chair with a look of smug satisfaction, sat bolt upright. "I'm sorry, Judge." His tone shifted from condescending to sharp. "That property is not on the agenda. We are discussing your violations." "Indeed we are," I agreed smoothly. "We are discussing the vital importance of following our community's bylaws to the letter, a topic on which you have been most vocal." I held up a single sheet of paper from my file. It was the photograph of his beautiful, new, and very prominent backyard deck. "I'd like to direct the board's attention to the recent construction at 24 Chestnut Drive," I continued, my voice even and clear. "A rather handsome deck, I must say. I estimate it to be approximately 400 square feet, a significant structural addition by any measure." Abernathy's face began to lose its color. "Now," I went on, "as our diligent president knows, Article 7, Section 3, Paragraph A of our bylaws requires a formal submission of architectural plans and a full vote of the review committee for such an addition." I held up my next exhibit, the photocopied minutes from the past 6 months. I find no record of such a submission, no record of a vote. I placed the papers down and looked directly at the other board members, the nervous men sitting next to Abernathy. "This brings us to a rather serious legal predicament," I said, letting the gravity of my words sink in. Abernathy finally found his voice. "This is irrelevant. It's a simple administrative oversight. We are here to talk about your roses." "We are here to talk about the rules," I corrected him. "And this is where the oversight becomes catastrophic." I held up my final document, the single page with the red box drawn around the forgotten clause. "I'd now like to direct everyone's attention to a fascinating piece of our history, an amendment to Article 7 made on October 17, 1978. I read the clause aloud, my voice slow and deliberate, each word falling like a hammer blow. "Any unapproved structural modification with a footprint exceeding 200 square feet that is not self-reported to the board within 90 days of completion shall be subject to a summary and non-negotiable penalty." The treasurer, a man named Bob, leaned forward. "A non-negotiable penalty? What is the penalty, Walter?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. I looked from Bob's worried face to Abernathy's ashen one. Abernathy knew. He must have finally remembered the rule he thought no one else had ever read. "The penalty is not a fine," I explained to the room. "The penalty is a mandatory restoration of the property to its original state at the homeowner's sole expense, meaning the complete and total demolition of the unapproved structure." A collective gasp went through the room. "And," I added, letting the word hang in the air, "if the demolition is not completed within 60 days of the board being made aware of the violation, the bylaw obligates the HOA to place a lien on the property and force its sale to cover the costs." I paused, then looked directly at the board members. "As of tonight, you have all been made aware." The trap had snapped shut. The silence in the community center was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the worn linoleum floor. The 30 neighbors who had come to watch my public humiliation were now staring, wide-eyed, at Mr. Abernathy. His face, which had been a blotchy red just moments before, was now the color of wet cement. The treasurer, Bob, was the first to speak. He looked horrified. He turned to Abernathy. "Jerry, is this true? You didn't get approval for your own deck?" he stammered. Abernathy opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the enforcement of rules, and he had just been exposed as a fraud in front of the whole town.
Another board member, a woman named Carol, spoke up, her voice sharp with panic. "A forced sale? Walter, are you saying if Jerry doesn't tear down his own deck, we have to sue him? The HOA has to sue its own president?" Her question was not directed at Abernathy. It was directed at me. In that moment, I was no longer a resident. I was the judge again.
"That is precisely what the bylaw dictates," I confirmed, my voice even. "It uses the word shall, not may. It is a mandatory obligation. Failure to enforce this clause would open the entire board to legal action from any other member of the association for dereliction of duty." I saw Carol shoot a terrified glance at the other board members. Abernathy finally found his voice, but it was not the booming baritone of before. It was a weak, strangled rasp.
"This is a personal vendetta. He's just trying to get out of paying his fine for the roses." It was a pathetic, desperate attempt to change the subject. It did not work. "Oh, the fine," I said, as if just remembering it. I reached into my file and pulled out the $10,000 violation notice. "I have no intention of discussing this fine." I then very deliberately, very slowly, tore the notice in half, and then in half again, and let the pieces flutter onto the table. "This document," I said, "is irrelevant." The symbolic act had its intended effect. The room understood. This was no longer about roses. This was about the law. All eyes turned back to Abernathy, the man who was about to cost his neighbors thousands in legal fees or be forced to demolish his own property. His allies on the board were now looking at him not as a leader, but as a liability. The treasurer, Bob, stood up. He was pale, but his voice was firm. "Mr. President," he said, the title now sounding like an accusation, "in light of this information, which exposes this board to significant legal and financial risk, I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in your leadership." Carol, the other board member, seconded the motion immediately. "Seconded," she said, her voice sharp. It was a mutiny, a complete and total collapse of his authority. Abernathy looked at them, his face a mask of betrayal. He had been so focused on my garden that he never thought to guard his own back. He slammed his gavel down on the table. "This meeting is adjourned," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. But it was too late. No one was listening to him anymore. The neighbors were all talking at once. The board was in open revolt. His reign, built on a foundation of petty rules and a single unread paragraph, was over. He was a king with no subjects, sitting at the head of an empty table. Mr. Abernathy didn't wait for the vote. He knew he had lost. He shoved his papers messily into his briefcase, his hands trembling with rage, and stormed out of the community center without another word. The sound of his car squealing out of the parking lot was the last official act of his short, tumultuous presidency. In his absence, the board quickly voted Bob, the treasurer, as the interim president. Bob, looking slightly terrified, immediately proposed a motion. "I move," he announced to the room, "that we formally rescind any and all fines and violations issued against the Harrison property concerning the landscape feature." The motion passed unanimously. I didn't stay for the rest of the meeting. My part was done. I quietly packed my file and walked home under the cool night sky. The air had never smelled so clean. As I approached my house, the soft, sweet scent of Eleanor's roses drifted out to meet me. They smelled of victory. The next morning, I received a formal, hand-delivered letter from the HOA board. It was an apology, a deep and sincere apology for the overzealous and unwarranted actions of their former president. It also informed me that, per the bylaws, they were now legally obligated to enforce the penalty against the Abernathy property. For the next 2 weeks, the neighborhood was filled with a delicious, unspoken tension. We all waited to see what Mr. Abernathy would do. Would he hire a crew to demolish his own beautiful, expensive deck? Or would he refuse and force his former friends and neighbors to place a lien on his home? He chose neither. One morning, about 3 weeks after the meeting, a for sale sign appeared on his perfectly manicured lawn. It was the quietest, most absolute surrender I had ever witnessed. He couldn't bear the humiliation of tearing down his own monument to arrogance, and he couldn't bear the shame of living amongst the people who had witnessed his downfall. I saw him one last time on the day the moving truck came. I was in the front garden, tending to the roses. He walked out of his house, got into his car, and for a moment our eyes met across the street. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply gave him a small, formal nod, the kind of nod a judge gives a lawyer whose case has been dismissed. He looked away and drove down the street, out of Oakhaven, forever. The story could end there, a simple tale of a bully getting his just deserts. But the true lesson, the one Eleanor would have appreciated, is not about the victory. It is about the tools used to achieve it. Mr. Abernathy's power was based on the assumption that no one else would bother to read the rules as closely as he did. He believed that knowledge was his exclusive weapon. He failed to understand that a library card is available to everyone. He was defeated not by anger, not by threats, not by a loophole, but by the simple, quiet, and diligent act of reading the fine print, his own fine print. The new HOA president, Bob, is a reasonable man. The roses are safe. Peace has been restored to the neighborhood, and my file on the matter, now thick with evidence and correspondence, has been closed and placed back on the shelf. A satisfying case, all in all. The ledger, once again, has been balanced. A few weeks ago, a new family moved into Mr. Abernathy's old house. They have 2 young children. The other day, the little girl, who can't be more than 6 years old, pointed to my garden from her yard. "Mommy," she said, her voice carrying on the autumn air, "look at all the pretty flowers." Her mother smiled. It seems the neighborhood finds the garden quite uniform, after all, uniformly beautiful. It is a strange feature of human nature that those who are most obsessed with enforcing small rules are often the first to break the big ones. Mr. Abernathy was so focused on the single rose branch that was an inch out of place, he never stopped to consider the 400-square-foot deck that was a mile out of line. He thought power came from the clipboard, from the fine, from the threat. He never understood that true power, the only kind that lasts, comes from diligence, from preparation, from taking the time to read page 84. This story from my ledger is not truly about a homeowners association or a dispute over a garden. It is about a principle I saw play out 1,000 times in my courtroom. The principle that arrogance always has a blind spot. It is the quiet, patient, and prepared individual who in the end dictates the terms of surrender. That is the story of the Rose Garden verdict. A tale of how a man's attack on my wife's memory was answered not with an emotional outburst, but with the cold, quiet, and inescapable logic of his own rule book. He wrote the law. I simply provided the interpretation. And now, as always, I am interested in your perspective. We all have a Mr. Abernathy in our lives. A petty tyrant at work, in our family, or in our neighborhood who seems to hold all the power. Do you believe, as I do, that the best response is not to argue, but to quietly prepare, to find the one rule they themselves have forgotten? Please leave a comment below. I read every one, and I find great wisdom in the experiences you all share. It is a reminder that these small battles for fairness are fought every day in every corner of the world. Your stories are as much a part of this ledger as my own. If this story brought you a measure of satisfaction, I would ask that you please press the like button. It is a small act, but it tells the great and mysterious algorithm of YouTube that stories of quiet justice are worth sharing. And I invite you to subscribe so that you do not miss the next entry. I want to thank you for your time today. It is a gift I do not take for granted. Please continue to let me know what city or country you are listening from. Seeing the places these stories reach, from London to Manila to my own small town, is a source of profound joy for an old judge in his retirement. Until we open the ledger again, be well, be kind, but do not be afraid to be prepared. This is Uncle Walter, wishing you a just and peaceful day.